let the rest join as they can. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Heather Roddy Bermudez on behalf of PRSA Miami and our Ethics Committee. Thank you for joining us for our coffee and conversation event this morning on disinformation and the 2020 election, a post-election analysis. Want to give brief remarks, just introductions of our speakers today so we can be mindful of the time. Dr. Judith Bernier of FIU, she is a director of the Center for Labor Research and Studies and is an associate teaching professor in the School of International Public Affairs at FIU. She's also the vice chair of the Miami-Dade Commission on Ethics and Public Trust. And Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, who is a professor of political science at FIU and is a frequent commentator on many things related to politics and really an authority on this subject. So happy to have both of them here joining us today. And our conversation will be moderated by Professor Hugo Ottolenghi of our Department of Communication at FIU. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Hugo. We will take questions at the end. If anyone has any questions, please do include them in the chat. And as you see here, our president, Erica, hi, Erica, is encouraging everyone to please share on social media and use the hashtag if there's something that you want to share. All right, Hugo, take it away. Thank you all.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Today, we're going to cover some very important topics, and we're really going to look in terms of ethics at the responsibility of different parts of the media world as to it relates to misinformation. So to begin, let's just talk about the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is when you make an honest mistake. Let's say you send out a press release and you announce that something's going to start at 2 p.m. and it's actually starting at 2:30 or 3 o'clock. All right, that's an honest mistake. Disinformation is the active effort to put out wrong information or misleading information to influence people. And let me give you an example that is from USA Today. There's a headline just recently, and I'm just going to read it on the next screen here. Wearing face masks doesn't lead to cancer. And this is from an article that says that a post that came out, and I'll just read the first example here, that the mask is giving you lung cancer, was from a Facebook post written by a fellow by the name of Guy Crittenden. He cited as a source different kinds of scientific studies. USA Today examined that, and here's what they concluded. It is false to state that a mask will give its wearer lung cancer. Crittenden correctly states that some chemicals are used in making masks, but misleads readers about the potential health risks associated with this material, especially when it comes to the chemicals remaining in the finished product. Similarly, ethylene oxide is a known carcinogen, but it's not used to sterilize masks as widely as the original post claims. This fits into the world of what is safe and what is not as safe in COVID-19. Let's turn that now to election 2020. And Eduardo, you know of an example of how something started on social media and made it into mainstream media.
Yeah, in general, thank you, Hugo, for moderating this panel. But let me just note the most recent cases, and that really affected the Hispanic electorate here in Miami. And this largely has to do with the way in which, and I should also say where I'm going to be talking primarily about how Republicans targeted the Hispanic electorate, that there was disinformation going on both sides, right? That this isn't something that's just the the monopoly of the right to out misinformation. But the recent examples, happen to be examples that occur largely on the Republican side. And so you might say that the disinformation begins, at least conceptually begins, with all of these so-called conspiracy theories that come out of movements like QAnon, that come out of certain groups that began in 2016 and saw that disinformation worked. It worked in 2016, and then it worked subsequently throughout the Trump administration. And they worked very well, especially during the 2018 midterm elections. And I'm talking about an umbrella message that was largely about how the Democrats were socialists, and that if the Democrats were elected, they would bring socialism to the United States. And this began, as I said, in 2016. It deepened during the 2018 midterm elections, especially against in the gubernatorial race, and that culminated with a very significant outcome where Governor DeSantis won, even winning significant portions of the Latino electorate, but also of the African American electorate, something that many people saw as is not necessarily possible, given the the Republicans have about these in general and about Hispanics in particular. But what we saw in 2020 was really sort of that logic taken to a kind of a maximum state. And that has to do first and foremost with the way in which the QAnon messaging became transmitted through social media, especially through mechanisms, through instruments, platforms like WhatsApp. A lot of the YouTube platforms, including YouTube kind of newscasts broadcast out of Venezuela, and then transmitted. You see, to me, misinformation when it occurs at the on social media, it's one thing. When it really becomes problematic is when that information then becomes part of the mainstream media. And what we found here was really quite interesting, that much of the QAnon stuff that got translated into Spanish, that got broadcast in these newscasts by Colombian YouTube channels, and then showed up dramatically in two places in mainstream media in Miami. First was not an op-ed in the Miami Herald or in the Nuevo Herald, but in an insert in the Nuevo Herald that ran for approximately 9 months, right? So it wasn't just something that was there, a one-time thing. It was an insert that ran periodically, and it repeated many of the messages that largely originated with QAnon, but had a very anti-Semitic component to them. And then the other side, of course, is that we had the very same kind of messaging showing up on Hispanic talk radio, in particular Actualidad Radio, one program specifically, which constantly repeated the same kind of messaging, especially about Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was supposedly funded by George Soros, was communist, and more importantly, was also into black magic, right? And they used the term black specifically, right? And of course, if we allowed win the elections, then you would have the Black Lives Movement knocking on your door, beating you up, and burning your house down. These are the kinds of messages that were all over social media, but then we're getting on traditional mainstream media. And then the final phase of this is that they were showing up dramatically in every single political ad. Probably the most important was Mariel Villasara's campaign in District 27, who largely used kind of messaging. So this is one way in which you see these conspiracy theories, this disinformation gets transmitted through social media, and makes it its way into different dimensions of, let's call it, traditional life.
Thank you, Eduardo. Judith, what is the responsibility of the average person, the citizen, those people who are going to vote, to look at this, to discern what's real and what's not real?
Thank you, Hugo. And I think before I even answer the question, I want to set the stage in terms of our current environment, right? You know, as citizens, we do not depend on traditional news cycle anymore. You know, the digital cycles every minute, every hour, and it's far-reaching. And given these rapid and short news cycles, it appears that our ability to decipher objective and factual information from disinformation is becoming increasingly inadequate, right? Because anyone has the ability to curate images and words to spread a narrative that may or may not contain verifiable information and or misleading information. Therefore, the average citizen, we must now possess the skills of mindfully navigating and deciphering this dense and rapid stream of information that we receive before we perpetuate disinformation or unverified claims, whether it be retweeting or replying or whatever the case may be. Citizens must now be acutely aware that disseminators and influencers who are in fact citizens themselves have a massive appeal to sway public opinion and undermine public trust. So we have to be mindful as users that we would decipher information and be aware of the influence that others may have on how we think about things, which in turn can also undermine the general public trust. So that's our responsibility. Be mindful about what we consume and how we would disseminate that information.
You mentioned influencers, which is a good point. Mm-hmm. How is it that social media has a role in this? We know that Twitter has started to label some posts. Facebook says it's making some efforts. What can those people who actually have sway on social media, and what do those who manage those social media platforms, what responsibility do they have?
Well, they have a responsibility to create an ethical mindset online, right? And citizens also need to also support citizens' short-term and long-term ability to spot untrustworthy news sources and information. And I think particularly they have an obligation to be more transparent about privacy and data governance, so that the general public, we are aware about what's being shared, or how we're sharing information, so that we could be more informed and make more informed decisions. But I think the social media platforms, transparency is something they need to really work on.
Eduardo, I think it'd be fair to say that they haven't done a very good job so far. What could be done that's better? Your microphone.
Sorry about that. It's a difficult question, and it really is a difficult question for social media platforms themselves. The reality is that certain platforms, Facebook, for example, have been trying to address these issues, you know, and for the last 4 years, they have been sitting in Congress, often grilled by members of Congress about, in fact, how to regulate some of this, some of the, you know, some of what's posted there, and so you really get into, you know, a much broader discussion there, because, you know, it's very clear that, you know, traditional media is governed not only by the First Amendment, but it's governed obviously by the FCC, and so, you know, traditional media has a responsibility to fact check, because if they don't fact check, then there are some restrictions there in terms of what they can and cannot publish, right? One of the areas that's really important, for example, is the regulation of hate speech, right? I mean, we can't exactly, although I think there's a fine line there, right? We can't, for example, we may, what to me is hate speech that might appear on Fox, right, may not be hate speech to those who listen to Fox, right? So there's a fine line there in terms of how, how some of the interpretations are carried out. But it's much more difficult when it comes to social media. One, because, we're not exactly sure how government ought to regulate social media platforms. And so largely what Congress has done is it has allowed the companies themselves to regulate. And so when companies themselves regulate, you have this very large area that where basically you might even say, well, Facebook is only making comments. Facebook owns Twitter, so they're only making comments. They're regulating Republicans. They're only bashing President Trump, but they're really not doing the same with Democrats. So you get into all of these kinds of things because there's not a uniform code there for that allows governments to regulate. Now, we do have examples of social media regulation, and they're found in China, they're found in Russia, right? Cuba. And so this is really, it's a very big and complex issue. So my sense is that the companies are doing a better job than can be expected, but certainly not good enough because so much is still filtered through it, and especially the hate content. Because I think one thing is to have a controversial opinion about policies, right? One thing is to advocate, control over the means of production, let us say, and to be a real socialist. But it's quite another to be a racist. It's quite another to promote, the kind of bigotry that we see today, and that's very difficult to regulate. And then the final thing is, it's probably more difficult to regulate where a lot of this stuff gets diffused, and that is platforms like WhatsApp, right? Mm-hmm. It's virtually impossible to regulate WhatsApp because who uses WhatsApp other than, you have your family, your friends, and you're transmitting private messages. So again, I think the companies are doing a better job than might be expected, but still one that's not good enough.
Judith, what do you think the line is? Where does it cross over from? We're talking about misinformation and disinformation, but we're also talking about things like hate speech, labeling people in a way like the Black Lives Matter movement as a group that's going to bring around a reign of social terror or terror in people's towns. But where is that line drawn, and how does that fit into what the responsibilities of both social media and traditional media have in terms of amplifying it? Because studies have shown over and over again that disinformation or negative information travels much faster than positive information.
Right, and I as Eduardo said, I mean, there's already work being done to regulate, violent content, terrorist content, and even child abuse content. So yes, the social media groups are doing a really decent job in harnessing or stopping some of this content to be further disseminated. I think what tends to happen is the fact that, if you're on social media, you often see what you're interested in, right? So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if I'm interested in a particular content, that's what I'm fed daily. So I don't often get a balanced point of view. But I think that's one of the biggest problems right now is the fact that we're just fulfilling ourselves and viewing what we already believe in, and social media through the algorithms or through the way the codes are set up or whatever the case may be, or advertisers. And we have to keep in mind too that these platforms are commercial businesses, right? And they do sell to advertisers as well too. So there's other complex factor as well in terms of being a social media platform, but in reality, they really are commercial businesses, right? But I think the key point of the point that I really want to make is the fact that whatever your interest may be, you're fed that content over and over and over again. So even if it's misinformation, if it's repeated often enough, you really begin to believe it.
Yep.
Right?
And I think that goes to Eduardo's point about the insert in the newspaper. It was not just there once, but I think you said, what, 9 times it was put in the paper?
9 months.
9 months. Okay, wow. That's even more, and nobody caught this. So for either one of you, what exactly is the responsibility of traditional media? Again, as you pointed out, Judith, these social media platforms are businesses, but so are newspapers, so are television, right? And television relies on ratings. So if it gets a lot of attention, is there a conflict of interest here between that responsibility to the audience and making sure that the information there is accurate? Again, for the most part, newspapers traditionally have been given a pass as to what is stated in advertising, right? They're not responsible to check out every ad and make sure that every price quoted and other things like that is 100% correct. They just simply are vehicles for those ads.
Yeah. Well, look, the reality is, in the case I mentioned in Miami, and I'm sure it's not a unique case, but the reality is that message, the insert in the Herald and the talk radio situation that I mentioned was actually by and I hate using this concept, but by Anglo reporters, right? Taught by the political magazine that initially quoted, in fact, quoted a number of different people who had been reading about this and monitoring social media. And then it was picked up by WLRN's Tim Paget, and then it showed up in Univision with David Adams. So it was large. So again, it's targeted toward Hispanics, right? And Hispanics were the consumers of this. But it was only when Anglo caught this that somebody complained anti-Semitic nature of the insert in the Miami Herald, or when somebody complained to Actualidad Radio the content of that newscast, that entire afternoon newscast, right? Or a 17-minute radio broadcast, also on that same radio station, with a very, very high anti-Semitic content. So the question really is, where is the responsibility? In this case, it was Anglo reporters who noted it. They happened to speak Spanish and they happened to see it, right? But I think that there is a great amount of responsibility that, somebody on the editorial board of the Miami Herald should have assumed. And it did have consequences, but the people were fired eventually. But in Actualidad Radio, none of that happened. And more importantly, I think the consequences have still not been felt in some of those talk radios. If you turn on the radios, because the conspiracy of the elections has now become the conspiracy theories of post-elections,
right?
And dominating the airwaves today. So this isn't the phenomenon that we're talking about that happened and it's over. It's a recurrent thing right now. If you listen to today to the radio, for example, about this company called Dominion, right, has changed thousands and thousands of votes. We know that's not true. Yet you turn on Talk Miami and you'll find that that's being continuously, right? And of the problem, of course, in our country isn't only the responsibility of the editors. It has to do with the fact that our national leadership is engaged in promoting conspiracy theories, and this is what we've had from the at least for the last 4 years, where we have, it's the president, it's members of his cabinet, it's members of Congress, and then it's our local officials. So who are we to really go to? Should we just go to the owner of Actualidad Radio, the editors of the Miami Herald, right? If it was at FIU, maybe, it would be the responsibility of our chairs, our deans, our president or somewhat. But, where do we go to in the context, in the broader context of this situation? We complain to the president. What does the president do? He just simply says it and casts it in a different way, but it's essentially the same message. So I think it's more, it's not just the responsibility of the newspaper, the radio station, the television station. This is a much broader thing. It's not just Facebook, right? This is a systemic issue that we're not addressing properly today.
And just to add to what Eduardo just mentioned as well too, sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between an editorial piece and an objective reporting piece, right? And even if information is actually retracted, readers have already moved on, because again, the news cycles are so fast and so rapid, so they may not even see the retraction of an item that was incorrectly reported, misinformation, unverifiable facts. So they move on with this misinformation because, again, people just move on quickly, right? So I think that's, again, the key thing is that, we don't often distinguish between editorials and objective reporting, and people just tend to move on quickly with information, whether it's incorrect information or correct information. It's hard to really get back in there and find out what's really happening all the time.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to bring this home to the people here on the meeting. What is the responsibility of public relations professionals, right? As members, we abide by a code of ethics. Our clients like to use social media, so directly or indirectly, we're supporting those platforms where disinformation is going out. At what point do public relations professionals have a responsibility, and what should they be doing? Should we be advocating more to educate the public? Well, what do either one of you think?
Let me just in the interest of your question, I've had a little bit of a role in the PR profession in the past as a political consultant, and a lot of times, of course, there are some major ethical questions that you have to address with respect to your client, especially political clients, right? Because one thing is to try to get your client elected, right? And the way you get your client elected is you do a survey and you develop a set of key messages to that really help your client move, right? What the Republican Party did very effectively. And this is really the issue. They did it extraordinarily effective. And they did it with the help of public relations consultants, with major national relations firms, right? They basically did research and they concluded that the socialism message was really the one that was going to be extraordinarily effective in turning around an electorate, especially in Florida. But now, as you know, that message is national, right? So now the question is that message true, right? And to what extent is it responsible, to call your opponents socialists? Now, there's a degree there. You might say, well, look, the Democrats themselves, some part of the Democratic Party labeled themselves as socialists.
Yes.
So therefore, look, it's absolutely fair game. There's nothing unethical about the message, right? About calling Democrats socialists, even if you're extending the truth a little bit, right? Certainly Mr. Biden is not a democratic socialist, whereas Mr. Sanders is, and he calls himself. But so from a PR perspective, and especially from a campaigning perspective, right? We always do this. We extend those truths, right? The question really is, what are the limits of that? And to me, the limits of that are when you take the socialist message and you incorporate into it these conspiracy theories, which the Republicans knew and continue to know that they are absolutely false. And so as a PR firm, right, should you engage in reproducing, you've designed a broad message about socialism, but at what point do you as a PR person in a campaign have the responsibility to say, okay, but I'm not going to promote, anti-Semitism, right? I'm not going to continue to repeat George Soros's name in every communications that, and I'm certainly not going to make the kind of subtle arguments, racist arguments about Black Lives Matter. So I think there's a very serious professional responsibility that I think these PR firms have, and political consultants have. Now, I don't know. I mean, your organization has some high ethical standards. The question is, how do we enforce them, right? How can we punish a PR firm that goes beyond, the professional norms?
Good question. Judith.
Right, and as Eduardo said, different professions have different ethical standards, but when you look at the average citizen who can also further disseminate information, distribute that information, retweet it, reply to it, how do you manage that, right? So I think first and foremost, these organizations have to make sure that they are disseminating verifiable facts, right? Things are factual, they're not engaging in psychological nudging and using keywords that give people some type of psychological response, whether it be socialism or Black Lives Matter or whatever the case may be. So that's their part that they have to play. They must provide verifiable information and adhere to their professional standards. We have professional standards in medicine, we have it as mediators, we have it as teachers, other professionals. But in terms of once information is actually out of the gate, you really don't have any control over it, right? And therein lies the problem in terms of what it becomes. You can become something else than what you intended it to be.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge.
Thank you. I have lots more questions, but let's hear from everyone here. Their questions, election 2020. What are the responsibilities of people in public relations? What have you seen in terms of disinformation, and how have you responded to it? So are there any questions, Heather?
There's a question here from Sasha. I'll read it from the chat. Can we continue to call social media platforms simply vessels, thus not liable for the content on their platform, if they then turn around and argue before the courts and the legislative bodies that their organization has First Amendment rights?
Yeah.
They oftentimes cite Citizens United versus FEC, arguing that companies have similar protections as individual citizens. We hold citizens accountable if they incite violence, actively defame a person.
Judith or Eduardo?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
And let me just say that I do think that I agree with where you're going. I think yes, they ought to be held accountable if in fact they're claiming that they ought to be treated as what you suggest. But I think that they've been very successful in essentially pointing to Citizens United, the decision that has a wide range of implications. I mean, everything from treating campaign donations campaign donations as freedom of speech, right? That's
Right.
how that was handled. So they've been very successful going before the Supreme Court, and I'm afraid that with the Supreme Court that we have now, it's even going to be more difficult to get anything overturned by a very conservative judiciary. So that's why I'm saying that to a certain extent, it is the responsibility of these companies. I think if you bring enough pressure on them, they will have to engage in a little bit more of self-regulation. But I think it's going to be very difficult for us to expect government right, to legislate any. And even if government legislates, if it goes to the Supreme Court, with the jurisprudence currently existing as a result of Citizens United, more than likely they'll be overturned and they'll side with these companies.
Judith, did you want to add to that?
No, I agree with what Eduardo said, and when you look at the social media platforms and you think about the shareholders, right? You have the users and you have the ad companies, and they have to balance who they're really serving at any given time. And then again, you have the privacy concerns and data management concerns. But I think they're doing the best they can at this given time. However, in the future, as more and more users begin to continue to use these platforms, how they're going to manage this vast amount of information and manage what actually users share and how it's shared. I mean, again, they're doing a pretty good job now with flagging certain things here and there, but I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to flag and remove things that we deem as harmful.
Very good.
Great. We have a couple more questions here. I'll start with Nathaniel. It says, with more journalists incorporating their own opinions in their pieces, how can we better manage facts and how we become the appropriate voice and source versus politicians, especially in a sector like healthcare where misinformation is rampant, and it's important that the scientists and physicians are the ones speaking on the topic?
Glad I don't have to answer that one.
In general, we just have to be more informed as citizens, right? We have to just be more informed of what's happening in the world. We have to be informed about history as well, so we can make informed decisions. We just cannot sit and passively be fed information and assume it's correct. So there's some responsibility on our end as citizens. We have to inform ourselves. Be critical.
I have a very critical view of what's going on with journalism in general. All right, and so let me into trouble with my journalist friends. Over the last couple of decades, this isn't something that just happened now, but this is really maybe a 2 or 3 decade trend, where journalists, have become the story.
Mm-hmm.
Journalists have become, today if you watch CNN, I can even tell you, who's on at 7 to 8, who's on at 8 to 9, but I don't really know what. Half the time we don't know what they're talking about. We know that the story is Anderson Cooper. We know that the story at 9 o'clock is Cuomo, and that from 10 to 11, it's somebody else. So, but we're watching these people who have become stars, right? And the stars are the ones that are highly opinionated, and reporters as such, the typical reporter that we used to have, the typical coverage we used to have, is largely relegated, and it's frankly disappeared. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't good reporting. There's some extraordinary reporting going on out there. There's some extraordinary investigative reporting going on. There's some very, very serious journalism going on. But the large part that we see and that most people see is dominated by these figures who are larger than the news. You know, these are individuals who are just, you know, so absolutely famous that, you know, they make opinion. And often, as we know, will repeat things that come social media, right?
Right.
So let's go away from CNN and let's look at Fox, where I think that this is probably much more the case, right? I mean, Fox has this tendency to repeat what's on social media, what comes out of these hate groups, and then broadcasts that and discusses that as news. And again, Fox has its own stars, right? I don't watch Fox that much, so therefore I don't know who the real actors are there other than Sean. But you know, if you listen to Sean Hannity, is a superstar. He makes opinion, and he doesn't do any research other than reading, it seems to me, what's on social media. So, so again, you know, it's the whole question of ratings. It's the whole question of how, you know, you're programming your, you know, I mean, the very President Trump knows, and that, you know, probably correct, that he has generated an incredible ratings war between CNN and Fox, largely because of his. CNN dedicates hours upon hours upon hours to covering Trump, and so does Fox. That's what gives them ratings. So I think, you know, unless journalists are really willing to go back to something that's different, right? I mean, I'm a heavy consumer of newspapers, but look what's happened to newspapers, right? I mean, I'm a minority these days, right? And you have some extreme reporting in newspapers. You have some extraordinary reporting in radio, right? Look at what happens in NPR. Some extraordinary newscasts that are there, you know, that sort of go back to the way in which journalism used to be. So I think, you know, the question is a very good one, because when you look especially at healthcare, where we need to be able to discern between what's true and what's not true, right? But again, when the very right is accustomed to telling us things that aren't true, and the media repeats what the president says, then we're really in trouble. So I think, you know, again, it's a very, very difficult question to answer without really getting to the core issue of where journalism has gone.
And follow up to that, Rosemary has a comment. The Libre, El Nuevo Herald debacle underscores the chasm that still exists between English and Spanish language media. It is like two parallel universes. The success of the disinformation campaigns signals the need for more cross-cultural communication. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, let me just very briefly address that. I think that's precisely the point. That Rosemary, you're absolutely correct. But let me add to that something that, in fact, Tim Paget told me about his own experience. He said, look, when I was growing up in Chicago, he said, you know, the Irish were a minority. And he said, well, when the Irish became the majority in Chicago, they began to behave differently, he said, right? And what he meant was something that's happened in a lot of major cities and with minority groups. When minority groups are minority groups, they can have this conversation among themselves where things are very acceptable, right? It's acceptable, you know, I mean, we know this kind of stuff from you know, even how, you know, it's okay for Hispanics to call themselves names, right? But it's when an Anglo person refers to us that way that it becomes discrimination, right? The same thing with, you know, how you refer to African Americans, for example, right? But the problem is when you do this systemically, when you look at it in terms of how, you know, how minorities have become a majority in this city, all right? We are a majority in this city. Now the majority has a responsibility to subscribe to these higher ethical in journalism, right? And so like it was in Chicago, right? What Paget was arguing was that in Chicago, when the Irish were a minority, they could afford to be, discriminatory among themselves. When they got to be a majority and they started discriminating, that's when things, right? And that's, I think, where we are today, right? In this community, unfortunately, right? The majority believes that it is okay and that it is acceptable to say racist things, to say anti-Semitic things, because there's a belief that there is no consequence until the Anglos point it out to us. And so, yes, I think, Rosemary, you're absolutely correct. It's very important to have this, I don't know how exactly to say it, but I think we have to apply the same standards in both languages.
Wonderful. Next one from Mark. Let's talk about sponsored radio, including but not limited to the Cuban, Venezuelan, and Creole speaking community. What are your thoughts of the power of this medium in local, state, and national issues, and the thoughts on practicable ways to influence this? I think this medium is little understood among many of us here.
Judith, do you want to address that?
Well, I think it goes back to the fact that, we all have a platform, right? And I like to say we all are like mini media companies. So I think when we have specific platforms or, podcasts or whatever the case may be that have a particular political angle or social angle, they're going to talk about what they want to talk about, right? And I think it has become normal to hear views that are very targeted and specific about any particular group, or to hear customs and norms or beliefs coming from a particular group and or population or ethnic group, or whatever the case may be, because we all have a platform, right? Some are more visible than others, and even people that, some what I call influencers or disseminators, they have a big of a population as the mainstream media, right? The bigger the influencer, the more followers you have. So you have, a following that's huge, like millions sometimes. And, you can create a base that want to hear the things that you want to talk about. So when you get to specific groups like, Haitians or Cubans or Caribbean people, whatever the case may be, everyone has a platform. And you're going to push forward that agenda based on the platform you have. You may not believe in it, you may not buy into it, but the key thing is just to be able to listen to various platforms. But that's not always the case. You may try to listen to various platforms, but as I mentioned earlier, if you're online and in a virtual world, sometimes you just fed what you believe in over and over again. So it's almost decided for you in many ways, what you're hearing and what you're seeing and how you engage. So we get built into this box that we can't seem to get out of sometimes. Maybe what I can speak specifically about the different groups, but those are the things that challenge us as a general public.
Look, I think it would be very useful to really get a good map of what is happening in our community, but also I think in most cities in the United States with large diasporic communities, right? These sponsored radio programs are important. They're very important. Not only because they sort of serve as a way for communities to kind of find assistance, help in integrating, right, and in surviving the experience of immigrating, but also it keeps them connected to home, right? And so I'm fascinated by what happened with Cuban radio, for example. If you look at how they went from and this you can look at it, you can trace it through the decades, to where now they have largely, Cuban radio is still there, but Cuban radio has now largely been augmented, in some cases replaced by Venezuelan radio, and certainly by Colombian radio, with the same. If you take a look at what Colombian radio does in the morning, right? You have a guy who sits in Madrid, right, who opens up the morning, La W, and he talks to the entire diaspora world, the Colombian diaspora. But a large part of it is here in Miami, which connects to 1260 AM to listen to them, and they listen to what's happening in Bogota and what's happening in Madrid or wherever there are Colombians. And so somebody will call in and, and the first question is, well, where are you? Well, I'm on 836. Well, it looks like every Colombian in the world knows where 836 is. You see, it's really not just a local thing. It's something that's become so transnational, yet it's just a radio station, right? So having said that, the other issue is really, you might, for example, look at the radio, some of the programs that are on there. They may draw an audience of maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people, right, who are tuned in at a time. At least those are the figures that I've seen, right? But one of the things that's having the most impact is not necessarily sponsored radio, but things like Facebook Live, right? If you look at one phenomenon over the course of the last election, it's this Cuban this Cuban man named Otaola, right? I don't know how many of you have seen Otaola on Facebook Live. Every time he has a program, he's got 40,000 people, not only in Miami, but worldwide, right? And he became an extraordinary vehicle for the Republicans through Facebook, right? And which in essence, in some measure, is replacing radio as a mechanism. So my thoughts, I guess, are yes, I think, Mark, you're correct. It may be little understood because again, it sort of goes back to the question, of, look, for example, I've worked in Haiti a lot, but my Creole is a disaster. So I don't understand Haitian. I don't understand the Creole radios here. But every time that I've done political work in Haiti, right, I know that I have to be on that radio. I know that my messaging has to go through that radio. So they're extraordinarily important in terms of those communities. The problem is that because we don't understand Haitian Creole, right, we have no idea what's being said on it. We have no idea if it's responsible news, irresponsible, if there's racism, if there's bigotry or what have you, because we're so disconnected from it.
Great.
We have less than 5 minutes to go, so let's see if we can get through some of the rest of the questions.
Great. Erica's question, do you see more apps like Parler coming out in 2021? And is this becoming the main divider for younger generations? If anyone, quickly. And then we have one more question after that.
Well, look, I think technology is such, that Friedman's book tells us that that the change every 2 years we have an entire different we've duplicated our knowledge. So this kind of growth is going to generate many more apps. Parler is just one of them. There will be many more. I don't know when they'll be coming out, but they sure will be coming out. And yes, maybe it is a divider, a generational divider. But look at who uses Facebook, right? It's older people.
Old people.
Right? And when Facebook was designed, 20 years ago almost, right? It was a young people thing. But today it's really, older people. And look at what's up, in fact, even today, during this campaign, it was kind of interesting because when I talked to American consultants about what's up, which we've been using in Latin American campaigns an awful lot, American consultants tell me, you use what's up? What is what's up? And there was this ignorance about what what's up was. So is there a generational divide? Yes, it's likely to continue. So there are going to be many more, and you know, in a couple of years, we're probably going to remember what's up as something of the distant past.
And lastly, real quick from Shirley, how can we get involved in educating local opinion leaders? How do we better prepare an educated elite at the various grade levels? I am an educator. Is there something we can do as PR professionals to bring up critical thinking about choosing an electorate among those we influence in our classrooms without taking a partisan stand? I thought the FCC regulates radio from the perspective of serving the social interest. Is hate speech not reason enough to deny a broadcast license to at least radio stations who broadcast it? Food for thought. One of the first things Hitler did was take over the media and the young. Shirley.
Just to add in terms of education, I think, you know, like my generation and maybe most of the generation that's on here, you know, we arrived into the digital world. The younger generation that actually were born into it, so they may be taking it for granted to some level. I may not even really fully understand the power of social media, right? So I think to Shirley's question, we need to at some level, you know, teach the generations how to engage publicly, right? How to engage in an ethical manner, how to engage as a collective. You know, the US is a very individualistic society, but the many cultures are, people come from a very collective countries. But we need to be able to teach the generations, old and young, how to engage in social media, and especially from an ethical standpoint in terms of how do we serve the public and, you know, what kind of world we want to see. I mean, it may sound a little bit cheesy, but, you know, we need to learn how to engage with others. That's not harmful, that's not malicious, and understand the implications of leaving a digital footprint on any media platform. Because even though we've been talking about traditional and digital platforms, I mean, to be honest, they all have different interfaces. So, you know, the Miami Herald has a digital platform and a print platform. So I doubt any one particular quote unquote traditional media outlet has just a one interface in how to deal with the public. So we just need to be able to know how to critically maneuver in different spaces. I think we're learning as we go, but at some point, you know, we need to really step back for a bit as a society, as a public, and think how we're going to engage with social media, how we're going to engage online. You know, what are the rules and parameters? You know, how we're going to engage ethically, socially, as a collective community, right? And education is not always a path to get something right, but it's definitely a step.
Thank you, Judith.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Eduardo, did you want to add anything real quick as we close out?
Just very briefly, Shirley, I think your question is really on target. You know, I mean, the reality is that, you know, extent, yes, the FCC regulate hate speech and the like, right? But it goes back to the question before. Understand Haitian Creole, and if there's hate speech going on in Haitian Creole, then how can I enforce anything that the FCC mandates? Or the same thing for Spanish radio, right? So is there a role for education there? Yes, there certainly is, and I think that to a certain extent that is occurring, maybe not fast enough. Right. My concern, though, Shirley, is that we have, you know, look, I came to in 1970 and sort of benefited from the whole civil rights movement and everything else, and came to be a proud, politically correct professor, right? But today, you know, political correctness is seen in a very derogatory way, because again, it's our leadership which has basically said that being politically correct is now, you know, something that's to be looked down upon. And, you know, political correctness to a certain extent, you know, basically rule conduct that allow us to get along better. But we're at a stage where it's now again becoming fashionable to not be politically correct, right? And when, especially when our leaders are engaged in that kind of behavior. So I think, you know, yes, there's a role for educators, there's a role for professional organizations, certainly, and there's a role for editors and media owners and everything else. But I'm concerned, you know, that we may have gone too far, and that rolling this back is going to be difficult. So, thank you.
Thank you all very much. And I'm going to just drop in here contact information. I know there was some more questions, so to keep this going offline, Eduardo and Judith, thank you so much. Hugo, thank you. I'm going to share your email addresses for those who maybe want to get in touch with you. And Erica Mayor and Isabel Gamarra from PRSA Miami. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Let me make sure I hit send on this so it posts. And stay well, everyone, and have a great afternoon and holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you.